At the wedding, I accidentally spilled a glass of wine on my DIL's mother's $50,000 dress. My DIL immediately slapped me and shouted, "Useless old woman, clean it now." My son just laughed. I left, but when I got home, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Colin, and at 65 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life to handle anything. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened at my son's wedding. The moment that shattered 28 years of believing I was a good mother. The reception was everything Calliope had dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk. Each centerpiece was worth more than my monthly grocery budget. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for special occasions, though it felt shabby compared to the designer gowns floating around me. I was trying so hard to blend in, to not embarrass Darren. My son looked handsome in his tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, but there was something distant in his eyes when he looked at me, something that hadn't been there when he was little, when I was his whole world. The accident happened during the toasts. I was holding a glass of red wine, my hands trembling slightly from nerves, when someone bumped into me from behind. The wine flew from my glass in what felt like slow motion, a crimson arc that landed squarely on Norma's dress. $50,000. That's what Coley screamed as she rushed to her mother's side. The dress was custom-made, imported from Italy, and now it was stained with cheap reception wine. Norma stood there frozen, her face twisted in disgust as she looked down at the spreading stain. "You clumsy old woman." Calliope's voice cut through the sudden silence. Every conversation in the room stopped. Every eye turned to us. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stammered an apology, reaching for napkins, trying to dab at the stain. "I'm so sorry. It was an accident. Let me help." The slap came without warning. Calliope's palm connected with my cheek with such force that I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. "Don't touch her," Calliope shrieked. "You've done enough damage. Clean it up now, you useless old woman." I stood there, my cheek burning, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The room was dead silent, except for the soft clink of ice and abandoned glasses. 100 guests stared at me like I was something disgusting they'd stepped in. But the worst part, the part that broke something inside me forever, was reaction. My son, the boy I'd raised alone, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, threw back his head and laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable chuckle. It was genuine amusement, as if watching his mother get humiliated was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "Mom's always been a klutz," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Remember when she dropped my birthday cake? Some things never change." I felt something die in my chest at that moment. Not break, not crack, but die completely. The last thread connecting me to the illusion that my son loved me snapped. I bent down and started picking up the larger pieces of the broken wine glass with shaking hands. Nobody helped. Nobody defended me. They just watched this 65-year-old woman crawl around on the floor collecting fragments while her daughter-in-law stood over her like a queen surveying a peasant. "The dry cleaning bill will be sent to you." Norma finally spoke, her voice dripping with disdain. "Though I doubt this can be saved." I nodded without looking up. What could I say? That I lived on Social Security and couldn't afford a $50,000 dress repair? That would only make things worse. When I finally stood up, glass shards cupped in my bleeding palm, I looked around the room one more time. Darren had already turned away, arm around Calliope's waist, comforting her as if she were the victim. The guests had resumed their conversations, but I caught the whispered words floating through the air. Embarrassing, inappropriate. Why was she even invited? I walked to the exit on unsteady legs, my face burning with shame. At the coat check, the young woman handed me my worn jacket with a sympathetic smile that somehow made everything worse. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember turning the key, putting the car in drive, or navigating the familiar streets. I only remember pulling into my driveway and sitting there in the dark, engine running, not sure I had the strength to walk inside. My house felt emptier than usual. The silence pressed down on me like a weight. I looked around at the modest living room, at the photos of Darren covering every surface, school pictures, graduation photos, birthday parties, where I was always the one behind the camera, never in the frame. I sank onto my couch and stared at the wedding invitation I'd proudly displayed on my mantel for months. The elegant script that had once filled me with joy now mocked me. I wasn't a guest at that wedding. I was an obligation, a burden they'd had to tolerate. The worst part was realizing this wasn't new. This disrespect, this casual cruelty, had been building for years. I'd just been too blind, too hopeful, too desperate to maintain the illusion of family to see it. But tonight, with my cheeks still, stinging and my heart completely hollow, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't Darren's mother anymore. I was just an inconvenience he'd learned to manage, a problem he'd trained himself to ignore. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning through decades of memories I'd carefully locked away. The humiliation at the wedding had cracked something open inside me, and now everything was pouring out. I kept coming back to one question. Where had I gone wrong? Darren's father left when the boy was 6, just packed his bags one Tuesday morning and said he wasn't cut out for family life. I remember Darren standing at the window for hours that day, waiting for Daddy to come back. I told him his father was on a business trip. The lie got longer each day until it became our new reality. From that moment, everything I did was for Darren. I worked double shifts at the factory, my hands raw from the chemicals, my feet swollen from standing 12 hours a day. When Darren needed new shoes for school, I wore my old ones for another year. When he wanted to join Little League, I sold my grandmother's necklace to pay for the equipment. I gave him everything I never had: piano lessons, summer camps, a college fund that grew painfully slowly with my overtime pay. I wanted him to know he was loved, that he mattered, that one parent abandoning him didn't mean he was worth less. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifices became invisible to him, normal, expected. I remember his high school graduation. I'd worked extra shifts for months to buy him a nice watch, something he could wear to job interviews, and remember his mother's pride. When I gave it to him, he barely looked at it. "Thanks, Mom," he'd said, already distracted by his friends calling him over. He stuffed the watch box in his pocket without opening it. I found it weeks later in his room, still wrapped, forgotten under a pile of graduation cards. College was worse. State University wasn't good enough anymore. Darren had big dreams, and I had small savings. So, I took out loans against the house. I picked up weekend work, cleaning offices. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could afford his textbooks. When he brought Kalia home junior year, I knew immediately she didn't approve of me. It was in the way her eyes swept over my small house, my second-hand furniture, my store-brand groceries. She was beautiful and polished, the daughter of successful people who summered in the Hamptons and never worried about money. "Your mother is so dedicated," she said to Darren that first visit, and somehow made dedication sound like a character flaw. I watched Kayapi work on him slowly, carefully. She never said anything directly against me. She was too smart for that. Instead, she'd make little comments that planted seeds of doubt. My mother always says, successful men need to surround themselves with success. She'd mention casually over dinner, "It's about elevating your circle," or, "I love how close you are to your mom. But don't you think it's time to establish some independence?" My therapist says that healthy boundaries are so important. The changes in Darren were gradual. He started visiting less. Phone calls became shorter. When I'd ask about his life, he'd say I wouldn't understand the pressures he was under, the sophisticated world he was entering. After graduation, he got a job in finance. Good money, important sounding title. I was so proud. When he asked to borrow money to invest in some opportunity, I didn't hesitate. $20,000 from my retirement fund. He said it was a sure thing that he'd pay me back with interest in 6 months. The 6 months became a year. The year became 2. When I finally asked about it, he looked at me like I was being petty. "Mom, that wasn't a loan," he said, his voice patient like he was explaining something to a child. "That was an investment in my future. I thought you understood that." But I remembered clearly. I remembered him promising to pay it back. I remembered him calling it a loan, but somehow in his mind, my sacrifice had transformed into his entitlement. The engagement came with another request. The wedding would be expensive, and while Norma was covering most of it, could I contribute to the honeymoon? Darren made it sound like an honor, like I was being included in something special. Another $15,000. My vacation fund gone. The money I'd saved to maybe see Europe someday, spent on a trip to Tuscany that I'd never take. Then came the down payment for their house, $45,000, that represented years of careful saving, of denying myself small pleasures, of working past retirement age when my body ached and my feet could barely carry me through another shift. "You're investing in your grandchildren's future," Chiappi had said sweetly when they asked. "Isn't that what grandmothers do?" I said yes because I wanted those grandchildren. I wanted to be part of their lives, to have a family again. I didn't realize I was buying my way into a relationship that would never really include me. Each time I gave them money, I told myself it was temporary, that once they were established, once they were successful, they'd remember what I'd done for them, that Darren would see how much I'd sacrificed and appreciate it. Instead, each gift seemed to make me smaller in their eyes, not a mother who'd given everything out of love, but a woman who had to pay for scraps of attention from her own son. The wedding invitation had been the final insult, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. No mother of the groom designation, no special seating. I was listed like any other guest, tucked into a corner table with people I didn't know, but I'd been so grateful just to be invited. So hopeful that maybe this was a new beginning that I'd ignored all the warning signs. Now, lying in my bed with my cheeks still tender from Calliope's slap, I finally saw the pattern clearly. I hadn't raised a son. I'd created a stranger who looked like my child but had the heart of someone I didn't recognize. 3 weeks passed after the wedding, 3 weeks of silence from Darren. No thank you call, no check to see if I was okay. Nothing. I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. The house felt different now, contaminated somehow by the truth I could no longer ignore. Every photo of Darren seemed to mock me. Every memory felt tainted. I couldn't even look at his baby pictures without feeling sick to my stomach. That's when I decided to clean out the spare bedroom. I needed something to do with my hands. Something to occupy my mind that didn't involve thinking about how completely I'd failed as a mother. The room had become a storage space over the years, filled with boxes of old papers, documents, and memories I'd been too sentimental to throw away. I started with the closet, pulling out boxes I hadn't touched in years. Most of it was junk, old tax returns, expired warranties, Christmas cards from people I barely remembered. But at the bottom, pushed far back behind a stack of Darren's old school projects, I found a box labeled Financial Records. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were all the documents from the loans and gifts I'd given Darren over the years. I'd kept everything, partly out of habit, partly because some small voice in my head had whispered that I might need them someday. The first document made my breath catch, the original loan agreement, for the $20,000 Darren had borrowed for his investment opportunity. In his own handwriting, he'd written, "I, Darren Mitchell, agreed to repay my mother, Colin Mitchell, the sum of $20,000 within 6 months of this date with 3% interest." His signature was clear and confident at the bottom. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't an investment in his future. This was a loan with specific terms that he'd agreed to and never honored. I kept digging through the papers, my heart pounding harder with each document I found. The $45,000 for the house down payment he'd written loan on the check memo line himself. The $15,000 for the honeymoon. Another promissory note in his handwriting promising to pay me back within 2 years. But it was the last document that nearly stopped my heart altogether. A credit application Darren had filled out for their mortgage. Under the section asking about outstanding debts, he'd listed personal loan from C. Mitchell, $80,000. He'd acknowledged the debt to the bank, using it to show he had access to additional funds if needed, but had never mentioned it to me, to him. I wasn't a creditor who deserved to be paid back. I was a resource to be exploited. I sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by papers, my hands trembling as the full scope of his deception became clear. This wasn't just about forgetting to pay me back or changing his mind about the terms. This was calculated theft from his own mother. The documents painted a picture I'd been too naive to see. Every time Darren had come to me with a story about needing help, about opportunities and investments and emergencies, he'd been lying. Not just lying, manipulating. He'd learned exactly which words to use, which emotions to trigger to get me to open my wallet. I remembered him sitting at my kitchen table 3 years ago, his face serious and concerned. "Mom, I hate to ask, but Kalop's been having some health issues. We need money for specialists. Tests the insurance won't cover. I know it's a lot, but could you help us out? Just temporarily, until we get back on our feet." $25,000. I'd given him that day, liquidating the last of my savings account. 2 weeks later, I'd seen photos on Collie's social media of their weekend in Napa Valley, staying at a resort that cost more per night than I spent on groceries in a month. When I'd mentioned seeing the photos, Darren had been ready with an explanation. "Oh, that was a gift from Kiapi's parents. They insisted we needed a break from all the stress. You know how her family is. They don't really understand when people say no." I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him. The alternative was too horrible to consider. Now, I pulled out my phone and started calculating $80,000 in documented loans that were never repaid. But that wasn't all of it. There were the undocumented gifts, the cash I'd handed over for emergencies that never quite made sense when I thought about them later. The car repair that turned out to be a down payment on a newer model. The stolen laptop that needed to be replaced immediately. The utility bills that were supposedly overdue but never resulted in any service interruptions. The wedding contributions that went far beyond what any reasonable person would ask their retired mother to pay. When I added it all up, the number made me physically sick. Over 15 years, I'd given Darren more than $130,000. My entire life savings, my retirement security, my dreams of travel, of a comfortable old age, of leaving something behind when I was gone. All of it was sitting in his bank account, paying for his beautiful house, his expensive cars, his wife's designer clothes. And in return, I'd gotten a slap in the face at his wedding and 3 weeks of silence. But the worst part wasn't the money, it was the realization of how carefully he'd played me, how he'd studied my weaknesses, my love for him, my guilt over his father leaving, my desperate need to feel useful and wanted, and used them against me like weapons. I thought about all the times I'd apologized to him over the years. Apologized for not having more money to give. Apologized for asking when he might pay me back. Apologized for existing in a way that didn't fit his new life with Coley. Every apology had been another small victory for him. Another confirmation that he could treat me however he wanted, and I'd still come back for more. I'd trained him to see me as a victim by acting like one. The papers scattered around me told a story I'd been too blind to read while I was living it. My son hadn't gradually forgotten his obligations to me or slowly become more selfish as he gained success. He'd been planning this from the beginning, systematically draining me dry while making me grateful for the privilege. I gathered all the documents and put them back in the box. My hands steady now for the first time in weeks. The hurt was still there, deep and raw and probably permanent. But underneath it, something else was growing. something I hadn't felt in so long. I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Anger, clean, pure, righteous anger at being treated like a fool by the person I'd loved most in the world. For the first time since the wedding, I felt truly awake, and for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space in my own son's life. I didn't sleep that night either. But this time, it wasn't because of heartbreak. It was because my mind was racing, finally clear after years of confused fog. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The law office of Henderson and Associates was housed in a converted Victorian downtown, the kind of place that inspired confidence without the intimidation factor of the glass towers where Darren worked. I'd found them online, specifically looking for attorneys who specialized in family financial disputes and elder financial abuse. Margaret Henderson was about my age, with silver hair and kind eyes that sharpened when I spread the documents across her conference table. She read through everything methodically, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said finally, looking up from the papers, "this is quite comprehensive documentation. Your son was very thorough in creating a paper trail. Is that good or bad for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Even being here felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about family loyalty. "It's very good for you," Margaret said firmly. "These aren't gifts. Regardless of what he's told you since, these are documented loans with specific terms. In the eyes of the law, he owes you this money." She pulled out a calculator and started adding numbers. "Based on these documents alone, the outstanding debt is approximately $83,000. That doesn't include any undocumented cash gifts. And it doesn't include interest on the overdue amounts. $83. The number hung in the air between us like a physical. "Wait, what are my options?" I asked. Marguerite leaned back in her chair. "Several. We could start with a formal demand letter, giving him 30 days to respond with a payment plan. If he refuses or ignores it, we can file a civil lawsuit to recover the debt. With documentation this clear, I'd be very confident about our chances. And if I do nothing, then he keeps your money and continues to treat you like you don't matter." Her voice was gentle but direct. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've seen cases like this before. Adult children who view their parents as unlimited ATMs. It rarely stops until the parent puts up boundaries." I thought about Darren's laugh at the wedding, about Kalapi's slap, about 3 weeks of silence. For years, I'd kept it on loud day and night in case Darren needed me. Now, I turned it to silent after 9 p.m. and didn't check messages until after my morning coffee. The first night felt wrong, like I was abandoning my post. But by the third night, I realized how much better. I slept without the anxiety of waiting for his call. A week after meeting with Margaret, the demand letter was ready. She read it to me over the phone, her voice crisp and professional. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, this letter serves as formal demand for payment of outstanding loans made by your mother, Colin Mitchell, between 2010 and 2024. Based on documentation in our possession, you currently owe Mrs. Mitchell $83,247 in principal, plus applicable interest. You have 30 days from receipt of this letter to contact our office to arrange payment or establish a payment plan. Failure to respond will result in civil action to recover the debt." "It sounds so official," I said. "That's the point," Margaret replied. "This isn't a family discussion anymore. This is a business transaction." She was right. Somewhere along the way, without me realizing it, that's what my relationship with Darren had become. A business transaction where I provided the capital and he provided nothing in return. The letter went out certified mail the next day. I would know exactly when Darren received it, exactly when the 30-day clock started ticking. For the first time in months, I made plans that didn't revolve around Darren's schedule or needs. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. I made a doctor's appointment I'd been putting off because I hadn't wanted to ask Darren to drive me. I bought groceries for one person instead of keeping extra food on hand in case he visited. The silence from his end continued. but it didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space, room to breathe and think and remember who I'd been before I became nothing more than Darren's personal bank. I started taking evening walks around my neighborhood, something I'd stopped doing because I didn't want to miss his calls. The exercise felt good, and I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years: new houses, changing seasons, neighbors I'd never spoken to, but who waved when they saw me. 3 days before Darren would receive the demand letter, my phone rang. It was Helen, my neighbor. "Call in. Honey, there's a young woman at your door. Says she's your Krina. I told her you were at the store, but she's been sitting in that fancy car for over an hour." Calliope, my stomach clenched, but not with the old familiar anxiety. This time it was anticipation. She was here early, which meant they knew something was coming. "Thanks for letting me know, Helen. I'll be home in a few minutes." I wasn't at the store. I was at the coffee shop 2 blocks away reading a novel I'd bought on impulse. But I finished my coffee slowly, turned another page, and let Coley wait. When I finally pulled into my driveway, Coley was leaning against her white BMW, scrolling through her phone with the practiced boredom of someone accustomed to having the world wait for her. She looked up as I got out of my car, and I saw something I'd never seen in her face before: uncertainty. "Colin," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "I was hoping we could talk." I took my time gathering my purse and the book I'd been reading, letting her watch me move at my own pace. About what? About the wedding. About what happened. She tucked a strand of perfectly highlighted hair behind her ear. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings." I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind me. She followed, her heels clicking on my hardwood floors. In my modest living room, surrounded by my comfortable, unfashionable furniture, she looked as out of place as I'd felt at her wedding. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, playing the hostess role that had been drilled into me since childhood. "Water would be nice." She perched on the edge of my couch like she was afraid it might stain her designer pants. I took my time, in the kitchen, filling a glass with ice water and arranging some crackers on a plate I didn't expect her to touch. When I returned, she was looking around the room with barely concealed disdain, her gaze lingering on the family photos I hadn't yet packed away. "So many pictures of Darren," she said, accepting the water. "You must miss having him around more." It was a fishing expedition. I realized she was here for information, trying to figure out why I hadn't called them, why I wasn't playing my usual role of the apologetic mother. "Actually, I've been quite busy lately," I said, settling into my armchair. "I've started taking some classes, reading more. It's amazing how much time you have when you're not constantly worried about other people's problems." Coley's smile faltered slightly. "That's wonderful. Self-care is so important." She paused, clearly working up to something. "Darren mentioned you might be feeling a little isolated lately since the wedding." "Did he?" I kept my voice neutral. How thoughtful of him to notice. "We were thinking maybe we could plan a family dinner soon. You know, clear the air. The 3 of us." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "Between us, I think Darren feels terrible about what happened. He's just too proud to be the first one to reach out." I almost laughed. Even now, faced with my complete silence, they were still trying to manage me with the same old manipulation. Make me feel guilty for not reaching out first. Make me believe Darren was somehow the injured party who needed protecting. "That's interesting," I said. "What exactly does he feel terrible about?" Coley blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, you know, the whole situation. It was such a stressful day. Emotions were running high. So he feels bad about laughing when you slapped me." The direct question hung in the air between us. Calliope's composure cracked slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. "Colin, you have to understand that dress was incredibly expensive, and in the moment, you assaulted a 65-year-old woman over an accident, and my son found it amusing." I kept my voice level and factual. "I'm curious what part of that he feels terrible about." Calliope set down her water glass with shaking hands. I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. I came to apologize to try to make things right. Did you? I tilted my head, because what I heard was an explanation of why your behavior was understandable and a suggestion that Darren is too proud to apologize for finding my humiliation entertaining. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in the years I'd known her, Calliope seemed to be at a loss for words. Let me ask you something, I continued. In the 3 weeks since your wedding, has Darren mentioned me at all? Has he wondered if I'm okay, if I was hurt by what happened? Of course he has, she said quickly. But I could see the lie in her eyes. What did he say? Another pause. He said you were probably fine, that you're tough. Tough. That's what they told themselves to justify their cruelty. Not that I was strong or resilient, but that I was tough enough to absorb whatever they dished out and keep coming back for more. You're right, I said. I am tough. Tougher than you think. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in my driveway. Through the window, I could see Darren getting out of his sedan, his face grim. He'd come to collect his wife and handle his mother. You called him, I said. It wasn't a question. Calliope had the grace to look embarrassed. I thought it might be better if we were all together for this conversation. The front door opened without a knock. Darren walked in like he still lived here, his stride confident and proprietary. He stopped short when he saw us sitting in the living room, clearly having expected to find his wife in tears and his mother apologizing. Mom, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Calliope said, you two were having a talk. We were discussing her apology, I said, though I'm still waiting to hear it. Darren's jaw tightened. I think we're all a little emotional here. Maybe we should take a step back. Not emotional at all, I said. I'm quite calm, actually. Calmer than I've been in years. He moved to stand behind the couch where his wife sat, his hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture that was clearly meant to show solidarity. Look, what happened at the wedding was unfortunate. But accidents happen, and we all react differently. Under stress, accidents happen, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? Though the wine spill was an accident, Darren said firmly. Everything else was just reaction in the moment. I stood up and both of them seemed to shrink back slightly. You know what, Darren? You're absolutely right. Accidents do happen, like me accidentally discovering some very interesting documents while I was cleaning this week. Something flickered in his eyes. What kind of documents? Oh, just some old paperwork, loan agreements, promissory notes, things I'd forgotten I'd kept. I smiled pleasantly. Amazing how different things look when you review them with fresh eyes. Darren's face went pale. Calliope looked between us, clearly sensing the shift in the room's dynamic, but not understanding what had changed. Mom, if this is about money, why would this be about money? You've made it very clear over the years that family doesn't keep score. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Darren was calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and what I planned to do with the information. Maybe we should continue this conversation another time, he said finally, when everyone's had a chance to cool down. Actually, I think my temperature is just right, I said. But you're welcome to leave any time. It was the first time in 20 years I'd dismissed my son from my house. The first time I'd made it clear that my space was mine to control. Calliope stood up abruptly. I think we should go. Darren hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave without some kind of resolution. Some reassurance that I would go back to being the manageable mother he was used to. Well, talk soon, he said, moving toward the door. Will we? I asked. How interesting. You haven't called me in 3 weeks. But now, we'll talk soon. They left without another word, Calliope's heels clicking rapidly across my porch. I watched through the window as they stood by their cars, having what appeared to be an intense conversation. Darren kept gesturing toward my house, his face animated with frustration. My phone rang 10 minutes after they drove away. Darren's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Another voicemail, then a third time. I turned the phone off and made myself a cup of tea. The demand letter reached Darren on a Tuesday. I knew because Margaret called me at exactly 10:47 a.m. to confirm delivery. By 11:15, my phone was ringing nonstop. I didn't answer. The voicemail started angry and escalated to desperate. Mom, what the hell is this? Became, Mom, please call me back. We need to talk about this. Became, Mom, I'm coming over if you don't pick up. By Wednesday, he was at my door. I watched through the window as he pounded on it, calling my name. I was in my kitchen making lunch, perfectly calm, while my son had what appeared to be a complete breakdown on my front porch. I know you're in there, he shouted. Your car is in the driveway. Helen appeared at her fence, watching the spectacle with undisguised concern. When Darren noticed her, he tried to compose himself, smoothing his hair and lowering his voice. Have you seen my mother today? He asked her, his tone forced casual. She's not receiving visitors today, Helen called back, and I could have kissed her for it. Thursday brought collapse, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She stood in my driveway in a designer dress that cost more than my monthly. Bacta sobbing about how I was destroying their family. I opened the window just wide enough to speak through. The same way you destroyed my dress at your wedding. She stopped crying immediately. That's not the same thing. You're right, I said. Your dress cost $50,000. What I'm asking for is only $83,000. Such a bargain. I closed the window and went back to my watercolor painting. Friday was the deadline Margaret had given them to respond at 4:30 p.m. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Mitchell, this is David Brennan from Brennan Kowalski and Associates. I'm representing your son in this matter. A lawyer. They hired a lawyer rather than simply pay me back or even call to discuss it like a family. You'll need to speak with my attorney, I said. Margaret Henderson at Henderson and Associates. Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we could resolve this without involving the courts. Family disputes are so much better handled privately. Mr. Brennan, your client stopped being my family the moment he decided I was worth laughing at while his wife assaulted me. Now he's just someone who owes me money. I hung up and called Margaret. Immediately, they lawyered up, I told her. That tells us everything we need to know about their intentions. Actually, it tells us they're scared. Margaret said, people don't hire attorneys for debts they dispute in good faith. They hire them when they know they're caught. The civil suit was filed the following Monday. Within hours, I had 3 more voicemails from Darren, each more panicked than the last. Mom, you're making this so much worse than it needs to be. We can work something out if you'll just talk to me. Do you have any idea what this lawsuit is going to cost me? How it's going to affect my career if this gets out? Fine, you want to play hardball. We'll see how this works out for you. The last message told me everything I needed to know about who my son really was, underneath all my years of denial. The case took 8 months to resolve. 8 months during which Darren tried every manipulation tactic in his considerable arsenal. He sent me guilt-inducing letters about how I was destroying his marriage, his reputation, his future. He had relatives call me to beg on his behalf. He even tried showing up with flowers on Mother's Day, as if a bouquet could erase decades of financial abuse. I didn't respond to any of it. Every communication went through Margaret, who handled his dramatics with the professional detachment they deserved. The settlement conference was held on a gray February morning in a sterile conference room downtown. Darren sat across from me in an expensive suit, flanked by his attorney. He looked older somehow. Stressed lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at his wedding. Mrs. Mitchell, his lawyer, began. My client is prepared to offer $30,000 to settle this matter and put it behind both families. Counter offer, Margaret said without hesitation. Full amount owed plus interest and attorney fees. $97,412. Darren's face went white. That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash. You had it when you took it from your mother, Margaret replied coolly. The negotiation lasted 6 hours. In the end, Darren agreed to a payment plan, $50,000 immediately, the remainder in monthly installments of $2,000 for 2 years. His house would serve as collateral. As we signed the papers, Darren looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before: respect. Not love, not affection, but the grudging respect one gives to an opponent who's proven themselves worthy. Was it worth it? He asked quietly while the lawyers finalized documents. Destroying our relationship over money? I met his gaze steadily. I didn't destroy anything, Darren. I just stopped pretending it existed. The first payment arrived, exactly on schedule. So did the second and the third. Darren never missed one, which told me he'd always had access to the money. He'd simply chosen not to repay me because he'd never faced consequences for his theft. I used the initial $50,000 to do something I'd dreamed about for decades. I booked a month-long trip to Ireland. I stayed in small bed and breakfasts, explored ancient castles, and talked to strangers who knew nothing about my failures as a mother, and saw only a woman interesting enough to share stories with. In a pub in County Cork, I met Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher from Dublin, who was traveling alone for the first time since her husband's death. We spent 3 days exploring the countryside together, and when she mentioned she was thinking of visiting America, I invited her to stay with me. "You have family in California?" she asked. "I have a son," I said, "but we're not close." It was the first time I'd said it out loud without feeling ashamed. My son and I weren't close, and that was his choice, not my failure. Eleanor visited 6 months later, and we spent 2 weeks touring the wine country, hiking in national parks, and discovering that friendship at our age could be even richer than it had been in our youth. We made plans to travel together again, 2 places I'd never imagined I'd have the courage or resources to see. The monthly payments from Darren continued like clockwork. We never spoke, but every check that arrived felt like a small victory. Not because of the money, but because it represented something I'd thought was impossible: holding my son accountable for his actions. A year after the settlement, Helen mentioned she'd seen Darren drive by the house several times, but never stop. "Maybe he wants to reconcile," she suggested gently. "Maybe," I agreed, "but reconciliation requires acknowledging wrongdoing, not just missing what you've lost." I wasn't bitter anymore. The anger that had sustained me through the legal proceedings had faded into something calmer, but more permanent: acceptance. I accepted that I'd raised a son who was capable of treating his mother as badly as any stranger would. I accepted that my love for him hadn't been enough to make him a good person. I accepted that some relationships can't be saved, only survived. The house felt different now, lighter. I'd redecorated with colors I loved, instead of the neutral tones I'd thought were more acceptable. I'd replaced Darren's photos with pictures from my travels, images that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. On my 67th birthday, I treated myself to a day at the spa. As I sat in the massage chair, looking out at the garden through the window, I realized something remarkable. I was happy, not the desperate conditional happiness that depended on Darren's approval, but a quiet, steady contentment that belonged entirely to me. That evening, Eleanor called from Dublin to wish me a happy birthday. We talked for an hour about our plans for her next visit, about the cooking class we wanted to take together, and about the small apartment she was considering renting in my neighborhood for extended stays. After we hung up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere across town, Darren was living his life without me in it. For the first time, that felt like his loss, not mine. Last payment arrived on schedule, along with a note in Darren's handwriting: "Debt paid in full." I deposited the check and threw the note away. Some debts, I'd learned, could never really be paid in full, but some freedoms were worth any price. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. Thank you for watching until here.